On the motion that, with an info slide, this House believes that Yin and Yang should be imprisoned. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Could I check that I'm audible?
You are audible.
Great. I would prefer points of information in the Zoom chat. I'll probably take one about 4 or 5 minutes in. Okay. I think the situation that this debate takes place in is one that is where it's impossible for the state to fulfill all of its obligations. It either lets a criminal go free or imprisoned and conjoined twin. We're going to show you why in such a situation the rights of victims, and specifically the moral duties of the state towards victims of crime, outweighs any other considerations that they might have towards other innocent individuals. So our stance is quite obvious in this case. We're going to imprison both of the conjoined twins and give them any appropriate treatment due to the fact that they're conjoined. That's like physical treatment and those sorts of things. I think the one thing we want to clarify here in terms of how the debate works is like we know with absolute certainty that Yin committed that crime, and like that's reasonably clear from the info slide itself. We're going to present to you 2 arguments at opening government. The first, why the state has a principled duty to imprison these twins, and secondly, why there are utilitarian benefits that weigh into our discussion. So firstly, on the principle, we're going to approach this in 2 main directions. The first being the nature of moral duties themselves, and second being the nature of punishment, and it's why it's so important for the state to dole out punishment when crime has been committed. Firstly, on the nature of moral duties, we think the degree to which you have a moral duty towards something is determined by 3 main factors, those being capacity, proximity, and reciprocity. Firstly, in terms of capacity, I think intuitively, if you don't have the ability to do something, then you cannot have the obligation to do it. If you have the ability to make something better, then we think in many cases that means you have an obligation to take that good set of actions. I think in this case, the state very much has the ability to imprison this set of twins, so that check is met. The second is proximity to the situation itself. So for, the intuition here is, for example, that like you have stronger responsibilities to your family than to wider society because you're more proximate to them and have a more direct effect on their lives. I think in this situation, because the state is the one that doles out justice in society, the state is the one that probably ordered the prosecution and gathered the evidence in the first place. The state is the one, the only actor within this society who is able to fulfill the idea of imprisoning people, because that's a responsibility that we grant exclusively to the state. That means that the state is very much proximate to this, that is also fulfilled. The third, in terms of reciprocity, if you enter into a contract, explicit or implicit, then we think you have obligations arising from that. I think in this case, what we have is a social contract in which the state allows, like people allow the state to be coercive in exchange for the state fulfilling its proper function, such as locking up dangerous people and doling out justice. I think that check is also met. I think if we look at the duties from this angle, that means the state has an overwhelming moral duty because it has the capacity to act, it is proximate to the situation, and it also has duties under the implicit and social contract agreement that it enters in with its citizens. The second angle we're going to look at this from is the idea of why punishment is particularly important in criminal justice and why we weigh the interests of victims and signaling that they are victims so much more. The first is that, like, under this, what punishment does is it means that society recognizes quite explicitly that the set of actions is wrong. If you do not punish the set of twins, what you're doing is that you're effectively signaling to society that actually this is not something that we ought to be imprisoning, despite like all of these other things that we imprison people for. What you show is that like this is something that you don't value as a society. I think that's fundamentally wrong because the state has a duty to set out like and follow the laws that it has written. But secondly, we think like if you don't punish the perpetrator of a crime, you're doing a huge injustice once again to victims who have already been wronged by the individual and also the state's failure to act. Why is this the case? Because I think it's extremely damaging both physically and emotionally to you as a victim if you have suffered the consequences of a horrific crime and then are forced to live with the knowledge that the criminal who committed that crime against you has been allowed to walk free, is just going on with their lives and the state isn't doing anything about them. We think that is something that weighs on you very heavily on a day-to-day basis and is a terrible situation to be in. We don't think that's something that we would like any individual to be under. That's why we value victims. But thirdly, secondly, we think we also value victims over criminals and victims over innocent people over criminals. Why is this the case? I think the intuition part here is like, for example, we allow registries of like people's like criminal past or those sorts of things, and we allow these things to be taken into consideration when hiring for jobs and those sorts of situations, because we think people have a legitimate interest in like sort of to some extent prioritizing those who have not committed crime as opposed to those who haven't committed who have committed crimes. I think that's just another example of why we generally value victims more than innocent people, and definitely more than criminals. I think that's another way in which you can make this moral trade-off. Before I get into the utilitarian benefits, I'll take the POI from CO.
So why is Yang any less of a victim?
I think Yang is not a victim of the crime itself. They're an innocent person. I've given you some analysis as to why we value the rights of victims more than the rights of, like, say, innocent people, or when it comes to criminals themselves. Right. Finally, in terms of utilitarian benefits, like, I think this also responds to the POI, honestly, because under some dimensions, the state's functions are also determined based on utilitarian grounds. The first thing we want to make clear here is that there is a huge risk of further crime being committed if we were to let the set of twins go free. Why is the case? Well, first of all, like, you've signaled to Ying that this is not going to be punished. Like, they can get away with whatever they've been able to do. The second is this person's probably quite good at committing crime and getting away with it, given that, like, someone who was literally attached to them for their entire life wasn't able to stop the crime from being happened. And note here that, like, op case can't just be we have maximum surveillance on these people, because effectively what they're doing is just like super strong coercion against them being able to live their lives out in full, which is basically imprisonment in the first place. Why then is this much larger impact that we ought to weigh in this debate? We're both on a principle level and a practical level when the government is making this decision. I think the first thing in terms of, like, principle is that you have so many more people who are going to be affected by this. Like, yes, the state, like, might in general, like, all else being equal, should not send an innocent person to prison, but we're not quite talking about an innocent person here. We're talking about a conjoined twin and, like, putting them in prison in order to save like 50 other people. I think that's like a temporary infringement on this person's rights that we are able to justify for the greater good if we think that there is this very real and pressing concern that Ying might commit crimes in the future against the rest of society. I think because that is like a very tangible future risk, that's something that we ought to weigh. But secondly, like, so I think that's in terms of principle. And secondly, in terms of the utilitarian argument, just in the amount of good that, like, people can do, I think the damage of crime is so much worse comparatively than just like one person being put into prison, especially because this is conjoined twin. They don't have the same quality of life as the average human being in the first place. Their life is probably going to be relatively miserable in terms of how this is going to play out when you're literally attached to a very bad criminal. I think at the end of this debate, what we show you is that the situation is imperfect, but in this situation, the state needs to prioritize the rights of the many and the victims before the rights of the criminals and others.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I be heard?
You can.
Okay, just give me a second to pull up a timer and just sort out my notes. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I think when the CA set this motion and they made it about conjoined twins, the likely implication of that was that this was clearly meant to be an exceptional circumstance, and it would clearly be an exceptional circumstance to everyone within society. That is, when the media viewed this, they would likely, everyone would be able to see why the state is behaving on either side in the way that it is. What that means is when OG tried to bootstrap the harms that happen to victims by trying to say that this is going to normalize crime sprees around the country by, like, all of the conjoined twins, they're clearly being patently absurd. That is, this is clearly a debate in which the question and balance is between the victims of Yin's crime and Yang, also someone who is ultimately a victim of the oppression of the state in this instance. What are you going to get from me in opening opposition in this speech then? 1, some responses to opening government. 2, I think a piece of characterization and on the likely circumstances under which Yin commits this crime, why that means that it's likely that the state owes both Yin and Yang some degree of obligations. Thirdly, I'm going to go through the OG principle, give you the balance of obligations, because they recognize the state has a balance of obligations and then just note one of them, never weighing them against any other obligations that might act, explain why that balance of obligations obligation comes out in favor of Yang. Finally, I'm going to make an argument as to why it is you're actually more likely to achieve rehabilitation on opposition side, and therefore if your worry is about victims, there are probably actually more victims of Yin as a criminal on Gov side. Let's jump right into that then. Firstly, two extraneous responses to opening government. One on the social contract, because this argument just pisses me off. There is no mythical document that Yin or Yang signed in order to consent to this. Note, first, Yang never actually violated whatever contract this is, and so I just don't think this matters. But two, no one ever consents, and therefore that any action taken in this debate is done under the threat of violence. That's going to become important later. Secondly, though, I think to the degree that they're talking about the victim's degree of harm, the degree of harm that occurs here is that you feel like justice hasn't been done. Notice all of my framing about why this is an exceptional circumstance means that that victim is likely to feel like the reason that justice was not done in this instance is because that would involve harming another. They likely feel empathy, therefore, to some degree with Yang, because Yang is someone who tried to stop this crime from having been committed in the first place, i.e. to try to prevent the harm that was done. And to the degree that empathy is felt then, this is likely to be a tempered emotional response and not a significant harm done to that victim. Next, let's jump into characterization about what I think this crime is likely to be. Two things to say here. One, Yin is unlikely to be able to premeditate this crime because Yin is constantly observed by Yang. Everything that Yin does is seen and Yang is able to report on that. To the degree that we know Yang has a strong moral compass and Yin likely knows this, having been with Yang for every moment of their life, it's unlikely that Yin committed a premeditated crime. What that means is that this was likely a crime of passion, i.e. to one for which Yin does not have, or a crime of necessity rather, I'm going to say in a second, because Yin cannot therefore have large degrees of moral culpability coming with premeditation. Secondly though, since the environmental and genetic factors that act on Yin and Yang are to a large extent basically the same, it can't be the case that one of them is inherently evil and one of them is not, because your personality is just determined by the genetic factors and the environmental factors in which you are raised. What that means, if such a difference happens, it must happen at actually a contentious moment. That is, likely a moment where they feel desperation. The urge to defend themselves competes with the urge to do well for others. That is, it is likely this was a crime of necessity where Yin felt the need to defend themselves from the situation that the state ultimately puts them in via neglect. That is, the state has already failed in its obligations to both Yin and also to Yang, and therefore it has to balance the obligations it has to them as well. Notice though, all my stuff about premeditation also means that to some extent, future crimes probably less likely. Anyway, let's talk now about that balance of obligations then. First, let me comment on, I think, the three likely kind of justifications we get out. One, let me talk about deterrence. I think deterrence just doesn't apply in this debate for the reasons I say in characterization. Before I move on, if it is a genuine clarification, sure, go CG.
Are you taking some kind of counter prop, like putting this person in therapy, for example?
Okay, I was just about to come to this. The reason it's not at the top of the speech is this is an analysis motion. So next, on prevention and rehabilitation. The thing I was literally about to say is that these can largely be reached by our side. That is, to the degree that you want to be able to prevent these people from reaching future crimes, the likely action that the state takes when you can't imprison them is probably something, for example, like putting them in community service, some degree of surveillance, or, for example, putting them into therapy. I think these are all reasonable outcomes that the state is likely to take in order to rehabilitate those people. I'm going to explain why they are more effective. The final thing to say then is on retribution. I just don't think retribution is an active justification for two reasons. One, I'm just going to contend it is actually morally incorrect to do a harm just because a harm was done with no other justification. That is, you just deepen the degree of harm that is done in the world. You put the world further off its moral track. Secondly, though, to the degree my characterization says there was no agency there, retribution is a poor heuristic because you can only blame someone for the actions they took with agency. And if they didn't possess that agency, you can't take retributive justice. What is the positive principle claim from opposition then? Look, prison is really shit. You lose your autonomy. You live in an overcrowded environment where you're at constant risk of violence by guards, by other inmates, especially given that you're a conjoined twin, you're likely to become a target. These prisons are underfunded. They lack things like basic sanitation. That is, everything about your life when you are put into these prisons is ruined. That is, if Yang is to be put into this prison, what the state is doing is when Yang has been failed by that state, stealing everything they have that remains from them. They are doing the most fundamental wrong that can happen to Yang. Notice, given everything I've said, the state does have an obligation to Yang. This also meets via OG's own criteria. I think that's relatively straightforward. The question in the debate then is, how do we balance between the duties? Two weighings here to the duties of the victim. One, this is the most proximate and severe harm the state can be doing. That is, where there are two duties that are in conflict with each other, the one you ought to fulfill is the one for whom the failure of that duty would do the most harm. As I've already said in characterization, the degree of harm done to the victim is relatively very low, whereas the degree of harm done to Yang is the most severe harm that you can do to them. I think that ought to be the priority. Secondly, though, notice that Yang has no self-defense. That is, there is a larger imbalance in power here. When Yin acts on whoever the victim of the crime was, the imbalance in power was low. That victim had some degree of capacity to defend themselves. In comparison, the state has an absolute monopoly on power, and Yang has absolutely no access to self-defense once they decide to imprison them. I think that's, again, a principal violation of what Yang's basic rights are. Thirdly, though, I'm just going to note that to the degree that Yang is completely innocent, that they even not were just innocent, but rather tried to act on behalf of the victim, this probably to some extent tempers crimes, or at least puts Yang at the risk of the retribution of Yin in attempting to temper that crime. That is, they took risk in order to attempt to protect the victim. Regardless of outcomes, what this means is that victim actually owes to some extent Yang for attempting to protect them at their own moral cost. What that means is if I'm balancing obligations, the most severe harm by the most powerful actor is done to Yang, but also the balance of obligations owes towards the people is owed towards the person who took the action that protected the victim. That person too is Yang. That means that it is completely principally illegitimate, regardless of consequences, to imprison Yang. You'll hear more on the rehabilitation from Lucie, but really proud to stand in OO in this debate.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Awesome. Let me just sort out my papers. All right. Before I get started, just want to say thanks to Andrew for partnering up with me on such short notice, and it's been a great run, so cheers. Cool. I'll start my speech then in 3, 2, 1. I'm quite happy that this is the final motion. It's really quite cool. And it also enables me to run all the weird stuff that Keeman and I discussed at like 11 p.m. on lots and lots of coffee. I think that what Andrew is able to prove then is that the state is the only actor that can fulfill its moral obligation towards the victims of this crime, and it just has an abstract duty in order to actually punish people who have committed these crimes. That's what Andrew's able to prove, and I don't think that gets too much of a response. I'm firstly going to establish why the state has this duty in the first place, and secondly going to potentially weigh that off against the harms that might accrue to Yang as a result of this, and the second part of the speech then is going to nicely engage with a lot of what OO bring, and presumably CO also bring, given that they flagged this in their POI. Okay, why is it then the state has an obligation, both a duty to do this and the obligation to, like, it's able to do this? So why do we think this, like, Yang in committing this crime, whichever one has committed the crime, I don't know, Yin maybe, why is it that Yin in committing this crime has committed a crime against the state? Because what do we think the state actually is in the first place? We tell you it's essentially a collection of individuals and the relationships that accrue between them, right? Which means that every action you do within a state necessarily has impacts on other people within that state, and so on. Like, you have some degree of associative obligations to people who exist within your state. So then if the state is just a collection of individuals in this way, any one individual committing a crime against another individual is also committing a crime against the state necessarily, right? Because that's what this horrific crime necessarily entails from Yang. He's doing something that's absolutely like horrific in these ways and is committing a crime against the state as well. So it's not just that Yin has done something against some abstract individual in this horrific way, but it's also the fact that he's doing something against the state as a whole. We think that that means that you probably have some sort of duty in order to respond to this. The second part of this principled claim then is that Andrew is able to demonstrate that you do have some sort of moral duty in able to do this, i.e. the state has some moral obligation in order to punish guilty people for the reason that it has the capacity to do so, because only the state is able to, like, organize organize jails, etc., because it's proximate at the point at which it's probably had a trial and realizes that Yin is guilty, so it has some awareness of the fact that this has happened, and also because of reciprocity insofar as the state has committed these harms and probably has some sort of duty to protect people within that, and it's failing this at the point at which it doesn't do this. So what that means then is the state does have some obligation towards towards its victims, It's not towards victims, towards individuals in general and innocent people as a whole. The second part of this is the utilitarian claim that Andrew makes, which is that Yang is probably someone who's unable to be rehabilitated to any meaningful extent. Owo try and say that this is like a crime of necessity, essentially. It's unclear why it is a crime of necessity, because if it were, then why would Yang stop the crime of necessity happening? Because Yang presumably also needs the crime of necessity in order to keep going. I think more likely then, there must be some sort of difference here whereby Yin has done something that's absolutely horrific, not necessarily a crime of necessity, but done something that's really quite bad, which means crucially that any sort of rehabilitation then is unlikely to work for the reason that it's not just that he's done something out of necessity or for any of those reasons, but probably Yin himself is just like a really bad person and so is unable to moderate in these ways, which means that at the point at which the state lets this person go free and there's some ability for this person to commit any degree of future crime, you also have to weigh that in the round, because at the point at which this happened, and if this person does commit this future crime, that then is a crime that the state has itself partly caused for the reason that it's been negligent, right? It had the capacity to stop this from happening, but it didn't. That's something that is also really horrific and something we ought to weigh in the debate. Before I explain why I think these obligations outweigh the obligation that you might have to Yang, I'll take a POI from closing. Sure.
Yeah, what do you think the reaction that activist organizations that defend people who are wrongly incarcerated will have to the situation?
Okay, like activists, okay, if CEO are going to go full hardcore practical and Naomi's going to give 1 billion structural mechs to prove something about activism, that's cool. I don't think it's necessarily going to matter that much. I think this house believes that motion, right? It's basically a thought experiment about whether this thing is right to do and has come from like literature in that way. But sure, if that's the thing that CEO are going to go for, have fun with it. Okay, why do we think this obligation then towards like the victims of this crime and also future potential victims outweighs the obligation to victims for Yang? So the claim that we get here from opening opposition is that the state has already failed this conjoined twin for the reason that it's quite hard to be a conjoined twin and something must have enabled this. I'm not sure if it's state failure, right? Because obviously in order for conjoined twins to even survive meaningfully in the first place, the state must have given some sort of provision to these people in the form of hospitals, in the form of constant healthcare, etc. So I don't think that it's necessarily a state failure in these ways, or unless like every single crime is a state failure. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think given the motion, we're probably able to assume that this was a meaningful choice that was done by Yin in order to commit this crime, because obviously Yang, having grown up in the same set of circumstances, wouldn't commit this and actively tried to stop it. So why do we think we probably weigh the obligations towards victims and towards potential future victims more than the harm that happens to this innocent person? I think firstly, just numerically, like there are a lot more potential victims, a lot more victims of this crime for the reason that this is actually horrific and has happened to a lot of different people. Secondly, and I think that LO actively like drastically underestimates the amount of harm that's been done, because they say, oh no, it's not actually that bad if you're a victim, if you know that your criminal hasn't been locked up. But I think it's absolutely horrific for a victim, because crucially that the way that victims operate in these instances is based on is to some extent irrational, right? Like even if it's unlikely that Yang is going to commit another crime, Yin is going to commit another crime against you, I still think that as a victim, you massively overweigh the potential of that happening because it's happened to you in the past and because of the visceral trauma that you feel as a result of this crime happening. Like this crime is really quite bad, and you probably also ought to care about victims gaining that sense of closure over the harms that have happened to them in the past. I think it is actually quite a large quantum of harm that has happened in these instances. But so yeah. Thirdly on this, I think thirdly I think within this, it's unclear to what extent we ought to weigh things towards Yang as well, for the reason that Yang probably because these are conjoined twins in these instances, Yang probably doesn't have the ability to have the same extent of quality of life as the other people, so potentially we owe them to a smaller extent. I think then ultimately the state has an obligation to punish people who have committed crimes, both for the sake of the victims and for the sake of the potential future victims that criminal might inflict harm upon in the future. I think that as a result of prevent this, proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for what was a fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for open opposition. Hear, hear.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
I'm going to do a couple things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about why they are more likely to harm future victims. So if you care about that, why it wins on our side. Then I'm going to talk to you about retribution and why it's illegitimate. And I'm going to talk about the current protection of society. And lastly, about the injustice to victims. Again, weighing it again. I don't think they will respond it, but let's go through it once more. If I have time, I'm going to tell you something about activists, but I think CEO is just baiting with that. Cool. Let's talk about the future victims. Note that this is highly likely, and so when they care about rehabilitation, the risks of Yin being a criminal later on, this is very much likely to get worse on their side of the house at the point at which they are putting them into prison, not just for Yin, but also for Yang. A couple of reasons why nice, stocky, schooly analysis. Number one, you just have criminal networks within prison, right? Note that very, especially in this situation, they are likely to have to cooperate with those criminal networks, and so far as a co-joined twin, you're probably going to be in quite dangerous situations within that prison, meaning that for your physical security, you will have to be getting into those specific alliances. What this means is that you are likely to have to be cooperating with people who are likely to be teaching you quite bad things. Two, know that Yang is likely to be feeling the failure of the state and going to be probably feeling quite angry, right? Given that you were innocent and given that you tried to actually prevent that crime, you did everything you could, yet you were still in prison, means that you are likely to be hating the state afterwards and after you get released. This means that you are more likely to be actually not engaging with the state and probably trying to do bad things to get your revenge. Thirdly, prisons are just really bad in terms of your removal from the society, right? Like you're probably going to be missing a lot of economic enrichment that you could be doing in those years, meaning that when you get out of prison, you are going to be poor, meaning that you will you will be likely to be descending into crime as a result to be able to get out of the situation. Two, you're going to have stigma around yourself, meaning that you are unlikely to be able to get employed, get housing, etc. All of this is just something that is going to be more likely to be throwing you into bad situation. Combine it with the fact that Yang is going to be angry about all of this and is unlikely to be willing to still have that sort of moral compass to prevent Yin from doing bad things. We think for all those reasons, it is significantly more likely on opening government that future crimes are going to be committed. Compare it to our situation where you have surveillance, and which I'm going to explain that later again, you have a basically very, very little chance of any crime happening ever again. If you care about victims and you care about the state obligation to innocent people, we think they are already winning on that based on the future victims. Let's then talk about retribution. I want to be extremely clear, and this is a positive argument, by the way, that it is unjustifiable on-site government to be imprisoning Yin in the first place. I would note that the reason as to why retribution is the justification for retribution is that you have to be morally culpable. You have to have moral agency for you to be able to, for the state to be able to say you are morally culpable and apply retribution on you. Know that Rhys already gives you reasons, and their responses to that were quite poor as to why that this wasn't the case here. Know that A, this is highly unlikely to have been a premeditated crime where there was some level of choice, because the reason is simple, because in that case Yang would have had the capacity to report it long time before it actually happened. But know that even if it doesn't matter what kind of crime it was, insofar as you just have a bunch of reasons as to why agency probably wasn't present, because you had extraneous factors that largely connected also to the failure of the state that did influence it, the fact that your economic background, things like your upbringing, by the way, this is not symmetrical, they could have been treating one of the conjoined twins differently, meaning again, different sort of influences. Even the fucking way that the brain is formed, is just something that the individual actually has no agency over, meaning no actual meaningful choice has ever been done. Because of that, and insofar as there is no moral agency, and good luck to opposing government proving that there is, we do not think it's legitimate to put them into prison out of retribution. If you're asking, is it that we wouldn't put anyone in prison then? We say we would for the other reasons, like deterrence, like rehabilitation, etc., or protection of society. Note that given that none of those reasons apply in this case, it is just not legitimate to put them into put them into prison for that reason. Let's then talk about why the other reasons also do not apply. In terms of the protection of the society, I would note that when they talk about like, oh, like they can be criminal and they might do something really bad, again, the fact that we are like the way we're explaining the alternative is likely to work deals with it largely, right? They say like you would have to be putting massive surveillance. Note that this is unlikely to be necessary insofar as you do have conjoined twins when you have and one of them, it already does have the moral compass and the incentive to be reported. What this means is that you very simply can put this individual under surveillance. Yeah, it's incredibly easy for Yang to be able to report on any potential risks, meaning that you're just going to probably have like very, very reasonable levels of safety. For that reason, protection of the society also doesn't apply. Given that, we just do not think that there's actual justification and it's in fact unjustifiable to ever put them into prison. The last thing I want to deal with then is the injustice to victims, the past victims. Before that, I would actually like to engage with closing off. Or not? Okay, cool. In terms of injustice to victims, like the first thing I would point out and the signaling effect that they have, I think we already have two responses to this. The first one is that given that it's probably going to be portrayed as a very special situation, we don't think that you're going to have a signaling effect of the failure of the justice system as a result. But two, insofar as we're going to have some sort of like surveillance or whatever, like you are not having that level of signaling that opening government wants to claim. Second, note that like to the extent that they spend a lot of time explaining why there are obligations from the state to innocent people and innocent victims, we think, again, you have to compare the harm to the innocent individual that is young and the future victims, and the harm to the victims that are already harmed. We would posit that there's probably very little that they're actually changing in terms of improving the situation of the already harmed victims. A, because they do get their signaling, so they do get the happiness from the fact that something has been done. Two, we are also happy to support things like financial compensation, therapy, etc., that can help those victims to deal with it. Three, know that like any kind of imprisonment might not be able to satisfy the victim fully, so it's unclear why they're actually fulfilling the obligation on their side to the fullest. But like know that even if you don't buy any of this, still the harm that you're feeling injustice has been done, it's probably significantly smaller than the harm that is being done to Yang. Like their claim is like, but like probably your life is miserable anyway, and like being in prison, it's like it's a small thing. Like again, know that the level of that harm is quite massive. I think Rhys gives you a bunch of reasons, like the fact that like A, you just do not have your autonomy, B, like the fact that prisons are just really shitty places, it's underfunded, you have overcrowding with violence from bad guards and bad people around, you have like bad sanitation, you are fucking conjoined twin in prison, you're going to be suffering massively. We tell you that if you are weighing these harms, again, you always have to go into protecting, the state has a bigger obligation to protect Yang, also because literally the victims owe Yang for the fact that they try to save them. For all those reasons.
That's time. I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for what was a fine speech. I'd like to call upon the Member of Government to begin the case for closing government. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. So before I start my speech, first, I'd like to say thanks to Jaime and I guess anyone that's watching from the Philippines, because it's 3 a.m. here, and I'm glad that you're with me on this sleep-deprived journey. Secondly, a content warning for my speech, so I will be mentioning sexual assault, murder, violence, and torture. Thirdly, lastly, my internet is a bit spotty right now, so if in case it cuts out, I guess you can just tell Jaime to message me because I have my phone on data. Okay, with everything out of the way, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are 2 things in this speech. Firstly, we will explain why this policy that opposition is purporting to support, or the alternative they're supporting, is torture for Yang, to live every day waking up to someone they feel might kill another person, to be forced to constantly surveil them. We believe this is torture and an injustice on the part of the state. Secondly, we will explain that the backlash experienced by not putting them in jail will make life not living for the rest of their lives, and the only solution to absolve them of crime and to give them some form of solace in life after the 20 years or 30 years you spend in prison is to put them in prison first. Okay, First of all, before I move on to the argument, some response, since I think OO has some compelling stuff about how why prison is bad, and if they successfully prove prison is bad, they can prove this outweighs the harm that the victim experiences under closure. There are two reasons why this is insufficient to meet the burden that they set up for themselves. Firstly is because while prisons in general are bad, we do not think prisons for this particular case will be bad for two sub-reasons. One, this is a high-profile case by its very nature. It is likely to be sensationalized. It is likely to be watched by everyone. Not only was a terrible crime committed, it was done by a conjoined twin, and an innocent is involved. But secondly, since lots of sympathizers and activist groups will be involved and will be lobbying for better life for Yang, they're not likely to go to the same prisons that opening opposition mentions. Secondly, we also don't have to treat Yang the same way we do Yin. Like, we certainly don't have to put Yang in manacles. We don't have to feed them the same food. We actually do think that you're more likely to put Yin in manacles and keep Yang free just because it's the best way to surveil Yin, for example, in prison. So realistically speaking, the comparative that OO sets up is incorrect because it is just not how it would logically play out in the debate. Okay, having said that, moving on to the argument. First of all, this argument concerns itself with Yang and what is best for Yang as well as justice. First of all, we think this creates a massive harm for Yang. You setting them free, one, risk the potentiality for crime again. So Yin might feel like they won't be punished for crimes. They might continue to want to do these crimes. This is not likely to be a crime of necessity, even though I think OG sufficiently responded to it. The reason for why it's not a crime of necessity is because we don't call crimes of necessity terrible crimes. We think we're generally justified. And like, I know it's some semantics here, but you would not call like robbing someone to steal their food or killing someone in self-defense a terrible crime. You would call it a crime of necessity, not something terrible. So these are not the crimes you're dealing with. You are likely to deal with crimes such as sexual assault, such as violence against another person, such as killing children. These are the things we consider terrible normally as society and from the average reasonable person's perspective as a debater. So you put three harms onto Yang for not putting Yin in prison. Firstly, he has to constantly live with a person that he feels they feel is immune from the law. They have to constantly watch this person. They have to constantly surveil them, as opening opposition suggests is the best way to resolve this problem. Secondly, they're likely to viscerally see any potential crime that might happen. They're likely to be forced to reevaluate their life without the aid of some rehabilitation. But moreover, they don't have the safety of being safe from Yin without having the capacity to be watching out for weapons every second and every moment. But thirdly and lastly is that if a crime is committed, regardless of whether or not it harms the victim, which we think obviously it does, the person also Yang also feels complicit and powerless in not preventing their Yin from committing more crimes. What is he impacting here? Imagine waking up every morning and knowing that justice has not been served. Imagine having your heart beat in sync with someone you feel as a murderer and has not received just punishment, has not been brought to justice. Imagine, as OO says, you have to worry about surveilling your sibling for the rest of your goddamn life. We don't want paranoia for this person. We think this is analogous to torture. There are three weighing reasons why this is the most important. The first weighing reason is that while it is true that in both sides you impose a harm on an innocent person, firstly, we establish both through the response and the material we provide that the harm experienced by the conjoined twin is simply less if you put them in prison. Secondly, this is probably what Yang prefers, since as OO sets up, they are a morally conscientious person. But thirdly and lastly, moreover, the harm experienced by the innocent person not experienced closure is at least equivalent to the harm inflicted of not going to prison. Why do we care about crime to some degree? Because when you kill someone, when you sexually assault someone, it is analogous to torture. It is analogous to making their life worse for the sake of it. It is analogous to making pain happen for the sake of it. But moreover, you condemn them to a life without closure, always fearing that Yin will come back, tortured and imprisoned in their own head, being unable to escape the past that happened to them. And moreover, they will, every time they see something that reminds them of this, and every time they remember that this person went free, that this person was not brought to justice, and that their crime will never be compensated for, we believe that you bring them back to that prison. So this is the first weighing reason. Our harm on a direct consideration of weighing against OG and OO already wins. But secondly, debate-wise, opening is pretty deadlocked in principles, where OG says the obligation to the victim is higher than the obligation to Yang. If we prove, and we have proved, that this fulfills the obligation of the state to Yang, which is to say, preventing them from a torture of constantly surveilling their sibling, preventing them from a torture of feeling like they will never be rehabilitated, then we've sidestepped this deadlock, and one already is closing government. So at the end of this first argument, we prove we won this debate because you don't want to torture Yang with the constant threat of constantly surveilling their sibling. Second argument, we also believe that if they were not put in jail, you're also likely to cause a massive amount of backlash that will make life substantially worse for the rest of them. Before that, I'll take a POI from OO.
Yeah, so the claim is that Yin did so terrible a crime that we see as so visceral, and yet they'll be in a lovely prison. I think this is obviously untrue. They'll be in a horrible prison in which Yang will still have to deal with being conjoined to them. All of those harms then become uncomparative.
I mean, Supermax isn't always terrible, to be fair. And also, we gave a counterbalance, which is that the sympathizers for Yang will push for you to not be in such a terrible prison. Anyway, first of all, we think this is likely to cause backlash if they're not put in jail. This is a terrible crime for 3 reasons. One, it's a sort of high-profile crime that has witnesses. 2, this is the kind with victims who are scarred for life, with family members left behind in the wake of immutable tragedy. And thirdly, this is likely to be the crime that is sensationalized in the media for profit incentive and just because it's super out of the ordinary. What happens when everyone knows this conjoined twin did not go to jail for a crime committed? 4 things will happen. Firstly, they will be treated terribly by everyone around them. People will likely hate them. They will never be able to hide just because they are conjoined twin. So they're forced to constantly be locked up in their house anyway and never go out for fear of being assaulted on the street, for fear of being insulted and harassed on the street. Secondly, as an individual, you can't do your job. Obviously, like you will not hire Yang even if he is not in prison if you know that the person he is connected to is a murderer. Thirdly, you will never have any social life again. And fourthly, for Yang, again, the feel of dealing with a violent Yin for the rest of their life. How is this the only solution, that is to say imprisonment, that will deal with this problem and absolve them of crime? One, even if you have sympathy for Yang, you're definitely not sympathetic to Yin. This absolves and puts a bomb on most of these concerns about sympathy to Yin because of the fact that you guarantee that this person has done their time. You're guaranteed that this person has been put in the slammer and has suffered for their atrocities, even though we don't think suffering is the main consideration here. But secondly, we also think that since it massively provides closure to the victim, they're more likely to do things like aid in the process for rehabilitation, but they're also more likely to forgive this person in public. They're more likely to do things that that ameliorate the public rage. But thirdly and lastly, we also think that there's a third party consideration here about people stereotyping other minorities, other conjoined twins as being able to get away with crimes and assaulting and harassing them. So it's for this reason then, for these 2 arguments, that we win this debate and we have a terrific finals. Thanks, everyone.
I would like to thank the member of government for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of opposition to begin the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
The state being the only actor who has the capacity to do X does not matter if X is immoral within itself. This debate is not about skeptical questions of how someone might feel or recidivism. It is about Yang's fundamental claim to justice, whereas Owo makes a highly defensive principle about whether prison or the possibility of recidivism is worse, which kind of just folds back into an argument about utilitarianism. We're going to claim it's an act of moral evil to instrumentalize someone for societal claim to justice. I'm going to start out by beating closing government and then talk about 3 different things. Firstly, why the state does not have a right to instrumentalize Yang, even if it is better for victims. Secondly, about the act omission distinction that I thought opening opposition would steal from around 4, but they did not. And then finally, directly weighing against opening opposition's principle. Let's deal with closing government. My first response to this argument is that the responsibility that you feel to police the actions of your brother is not going to evaporate within prison. That is to say, within prison, people also commit a lot of crimes. There's also the possibility that they could try and assault someone. There's also the possibility that they could try and kill someone. In fact, crime rates tend to be incredibly high within prison. So the paranoia that you feel is probably going to be symmetric. And therefore, we should weigh this debate on the kind of agency that you have as an individual. It's the fact that when you are in prison, you cannot go on like beautiful walks and smell the flowers and see the stars at night. It's the fact that you probably can't get your job back. You can't see your family, your friends. You can't access basic kinds of technology. Even if there are activist groups at first, public interest is probably going to fade in your case eventually, and they can't give you things back that the prison stole from you in terms of your fundamental liberty. Secondly, ways and the paranoia that you feel can just be fairly mitigated under our side of a house. If you're so paranoid, you can deal with this absent of the state as a direct mechanism. That is to say, you can talk to your family members about this paranoia. You could probably like hire people who could help watch. You could push for things like an ankle bracelet to like reduce your individual kind of paranoia. I think that thirdly, you could just individually rationalize the kind of responsibility that you feel for your conjoined twin. That is to say, you could tell yourself, even if this person commits another crime, I'm virtually powerless in this. I deserve a fundamental right to my own liberty. And my final response to this argument, and this is crucial, panel, even if it might be better for Yang from an objective perspective to go to prison, this is not something that the state has a moral authority to decide on Yang's behalf. That is to say, they cannot make the decision for you and presume your interest that you want to go to prison when they also have conflicting obligations to guarantee your right to procedural justice. First extension, why does the state have absolutely no right to instrumentalize Yang? Yang, like all people within society, is owed a basic level of procedural justice by the state when it comes to the justice system. Number one, basically all of our rights are constrained by the justice system. So a right to mobility, because we cannot move in prison, a right to say and do whatever we want within prison is massively constrained. But number two, the state is just a vastly coercive institution. So Yang is owed justice. By putting Yang in prison, The state is ignoring the individual claim that Yang has to procedural justice and is effectively using Yang as a pawn in a bid for social protection. This is wrong because I think that persons should not only be used merely as a means to an end to improve the welfare of others, because doing so violates the fundamental claim that they have to individual kind of self-ownership. That is to say, my life, my labor, and the person that I am belongs to me and me alone, and I'm not at the disposal of society as a whole. Even if the state theoretically has obligations to other people via the social contract, it doesn't mean that the moral onus of the state's obligation should be placed on Yang as an individual to facilitate the rights that the state owes to other people. That is to say, Yang is not a disposable pawn of the government to fulfill whatever obligations the government has to other people. So I think that therefore we should treat people as an end within themselves. Here are just a few intuition pumps of instrumentalization being incredibly wrong. The majority of us would probably disagree that if I, as a healthy person, walked into a doctor's office, you cannot kill me to give organs to 5 other people, just like classic thought experiment against utilitarianism. We would probably not push a fat man in front of a trolley if doing so would like steer the trolley into the track that is only going to kill 1 person rather than kill 5 people. We would probably not pick off an innocent person from the street and put them in prison. That is going to have a greater deterrent effect that would benefit society as a whole, because we recognize that individual people have rights, and I don't think either government team actually proves when individual rights can be used for the disposal of society as a whole. The second claim that I want to make is about the act-omission distinction, but before that, opening government.
Yeah, so the state instrumentalizes people all the time. It takes away your hard-earned labor in the form of tax. Why is this form of instrumentalization unjustified?
Number one, just because the state does something, it doesn't mean that it's justified for them to do it. I think that broadly we would support a society with lower tax rates because we think that it's wrong for the government to do that. Number two, you cannot compare the scale of instrumentalization that comes from taxation, which is often privileged people who benefit from the state in a variety of ways, and therefore it just becomes a reciprocal obligation, especially when you're exploiting other workers in the labor market, relative to like the massive loss of freedom that literally comes from being plonked in prison. On the act-omission distinction, basically what we're saying here is that the moral wrong that is committed by the state is comparatively larger when they actively put an innocent person in jail, as opposed to when they don't do anything, even if that theoretically increases the probability of crime being committed in the future. This is because it's a huge moral evil to put an innocent person in prison, whereas if you do nothing, you have absolutely no blood on your hands. You haven't directly caused any harm to anyone overall. I think that specifically in this case, the state becomes a uniquely perverse moral actor because they commit 2 moral wrongs rather than just one. That is to say, the state committed the moral wrong of failing to stop the crime in the first place, and they're committing the moral wrong of putting an innocent person in prison. I'm going to give the exact same intuition pump I gave in round 4 because it seemed to be quite effective and opening opposition did not steal it, which is basically the fact that if I'm a rich person, I commit a far greater moral wrong by killing a child directly than the moral wrong that I commit of just having a lot of wealth and making the choice not to donate that wealth because I'm a very, very selfish person. So by actively incarcerating an innocent person, the blood on the hands of the state becomes substantially larger than if the state just passively decides to do nothing. Before I weigh us against opening opposition, I just want to do an additional level of weighing, which is like kind of a third extension contribution of the principle of certainty versus uncertainty. So number one, in terms of the wishes of victims, it is uncertain what victims actually want in this debate, and you cannot approximate what their desire for social retribution actually are. There are a lot of people under the status quo and a lot of victims who are actively against the death penalty. And so far as you cannot approximate what a victim's desire for retribution actually is, you should cite on the fact of guaranteeing a basic level of procedural justice. But secondly, it is uncertain that a crime is going to occur in the future. You can just credit O's mechanization for that, where there is a certain moral wrong that Yang is an innocent victim who is now effectively being put in prison. What this means is that even if there are 2 innocent people who might ultimately be harmed, we should side with the principle of moral certainty. That is to say, we know that Yang as an innocent person is going to be punished, but we don't know if it's actually true that an innocent person is going to be harmed on the future. Finally, let's weigh us against opening opposition. So opening opposition basically says prison is really shit. Victims might not be harmed in the future. Therefore, we ought to just decide on the basis of like utility of prisons being really bad. The first thing to say is that this relies on the characterization of prison being worse and harms that are done to future victims, but I think that CG is effectively able to mitigate, and it's actually quite an uncertain practical argument. But secondly, our principle is substantially more offensive than theirs because it says that the relative scale of harm that might occur to future victims is irrelevant, insofar as you have no right to use me to try and help those future victims. So our principle exists independently of proving the likelihood of recidivism at the end of the day. For all of those reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the government whip to close off the case for closing government. Hear, hear.
Can I be seen and heard? Sorry. All right. 3, 2, 1. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, where are we more principally justified? Secondly, where are yin and yang better off? First, where are we more principally justified? First, let's just get rid of all the weasels that the opening house gave on the other side. Right? They said, firstly, yin can't premeditate the crime because yang can watch. So yin couldn't have premeditated it. It had to be a crime of passion or a crime of necessity. Firstly, conjoined twins have different control over different body parts. Right? So some conjoined twins have equal control, like one arm and one leg. Other conjoined twins, one person has control over both legs in a lot of these instances. Right? So if yang wanted to stop yin from doing the crime, like it says in the slide, but yang wasn't able to, this means it's incredibly likely that yin has more control over the body, which means that yin could have premeditated the crime. And even if yang wanted to do something about it or report yin to the police or do something about it, it's incredibly unlikely yin had the capacity or the control to be able to do that, which is why yang wasn't able to stop the crime in all these instances. It's also because they're connected, but they have separate brains, right? So you can't yang can't tell what's in yin's brain. So yin could have been premeditating the crime, but they could have just lied to yang and in other instances and said oh no, I want to do this thing that's actually really wholesome, for example, and then actually just did the crime when they were already there face to face with the other individuals. So it's incredibly likely that they could have premeditated the crime. I don't know why it isn't. The next thing they said is yin can't be evil because they have the same genes. It's like the crime of necessity. Firstly, that's not how genes work. Just because they're twins doesn't mean they have the same father. They could have different fathers. Secondly, just because they're twins doesn't mean they have the same DNA. They could have different DNA because DNA is 50%, 50%. But there's not necessarily the same 50% from both parents. So it's not really true that they have the same genes. Thirdly, they could have different nurtures, right? Depending on their control over the body, depending on how they were treated growing up, they could have different nurtures in a lot of these instances. So it's not true that yin can't be evil in this instance. But also, the idea of human agency is that we have the sentience to react to stimulus in different ways. This means that even if they were given the same nurture, even if they have the same DNA, presumably, given human sentience, given human intelligence, they could react in different ways, and yin could become evil while yang chooses not to become evil. So we don't know why this is true. But also, even if it is a crime of necessity, I don't know why this motion would exist, right? Because you wouldn't go to jail anyway. There's no jail time for self-defense or murder in self-defense in a lot of these instances. Lastly, the motion side says it's a terrible crime. So given all this, a lot of the things from opening already false. Given this, let's go to responses to the previous speaker. The previous speaker first said, the responsibility to watch over your twin will be symmetric. In prison, you'll also have the paranoia of watching over your twin in all these instances. This is untrue. 4 levels of response. Firstly, the twin will likely be handcuffed, right? So it's highly likely that the twin won't be able to do the crime, won't have the same capacity to do the crime. If not handcuffed, maybe a muzzle, maybe other things to the twin to make sure that they wouldn't be violent or they wouldn't be able to do the crime. Secondly, you have security guards watching over you in prison, unlike in real life where you could just be twin alone or twin alone with the victim, for example, without having security guards watching over you. Thirdly, your yin won't have access to any weapons in prison. If yin, for example, use a gun to do the crime, use a knife to do the crime, they wouldn't have access to those things in the prison, so that would be a relief to your conscience, they wouldn't be able to do the crime because they don't have access to the weapons. Lastly, mentally, you don't feel like it's your responsibility to watch over your twin when you're in prison because you feel like it's the responsibility of the security guards, because you feel like it's the responsibility of the prison system or the government now that you're already in prison. On their side, if you're outside, especially given the model of OO, where you'd force Yang to watch over Yin 24/7, you'd feel like it's your responsibility. You'd feel like it's your fault if another crime happens. You'd feel like the constant paranoia of constantly watching over your twin to make sure that they aren't up to anything evil or they aren't trying to look for weapons or doing anything in all these instances. So we don't know whether the response is true. Moving on, both sides, both opening and closing, agree that, prisons are terrible. It'll make you be abusive. It'll make you be really bad. Firstly, we already told you it's not likely you're going to be put in a really bad prison because of the lobby, because of the support and the sympathy, and because in consideration of Yang. But secondly, prison isn't likely to be so terrible to them. So that even within prison, there are things called prison rules or unspoken rules, right? So there's likely special care from fellow prisoners and prison guards towards Yang. Given one, Yang is innocent, but also given two, that they're conjoined twins. So they're likely to get special care. Even if they did go to a bad prison, they aren't going to be treated like all the other prisoners in those instances. But thirdly, there's a greater principle at hand, right? So more than just the agency to walk around and do all these other things, it's the agency to be free from prison, free from torture in a far worse prison, right? And we told you why it's far worse for Yang to be stuck with Yin outside. Firstly, it isn't only it's the thing I told you earlier, right? You constantly have to watch over your twin. You're constantly paranoid about that. But more than this, there are other layers of analysis my previous speaker gave you that we heard no response to, right? Firstly, the feeling that you didn't get justice, knowing you didn't get justice for the victim, right? The feeling that you're complicit in doing the crime because you did everything you could to stop him, but you know you weren't able to stop him. Maybe you could have done more. These are the thoughts that run through Yang's mind all the time, especially since Yin didn't go to prison because of Yang, because the lobby was such that because Yang exists, Yin didn't go to prison. So Yang weighs heavily, the victim weighs heavily the situation in all these instances, right? So you're constantly blaming yourself. You're constantly reliving the trauma of the victim. And why is this so bad? Because it's likely Yang viscerally felt like they did the crime. Given like the neural structure of them, it's incredibly likely Yang felt it when they were assaulting the victim, or when they were doing the harmful action, or at least had to be there and see it when the crime was being committed and the terrible crime was happening. So likely this trauma, this paranoia, this fear is very strong in Yang, and this is significantly important because of like how much of torture it is in this specific instance. Given this, what else did the previous speaker say? The previous speaker said, individual rights cannot be taken. You can't be utilitarian. You can't do active harm to another individual. First response, this isn't true, right? Just because you gave lots of thought experiments, that doesn't really substitute any analysis. You didn't really prove why your analysis was true, right? More than all this, second level response, the state does this all the time, as long as the state knows that it's within your best interest. We force people to go to rehab, even if like doing weed might not be that bad, because we think it's within the person's best interest. We take away their rights, we force them to go to rehab, which is in effect like a prison in a lot of these instances, right? So we proved why this is the case, that it was actually better for Yang. So we think the case from the previous speaker doesn't actually stand in this debate. We win principally on multiple fronts, and we told you why it's so much worse. Second issue, and I think we clearly win this issue. Where are Yin and Yang actually better off? Firstly, both sides agreed, Yang will suddenly become a criminal. Firstly, it's not likely they're going to go to a really bad prison. Secondly, you can treat Yang differently from Yin, so Yang isn't likely to become a prisoner, or isn't likely to become a criminal or do really bad actions. Next, they said that you won't be able to get jobs when you come out of prison, or you'll be treated badly when you come out of prison. And this is really where our extension came into this debate, and we heard no real response to, right? You're not going, when you don't go to jail in a very high profile case where a lot of people likely know about it because it's a terrible crime, where there are family members of the victim, where it's like it's sensationalized by the media because of how dramatic it is, or one twin didn't want the crime to happen, one twin did, and like there's a victim and it's conjoined twins. It's incredibly likely you're gonna face terrible backlash, right? Lots of people will want to harass you. Lots of people will be mad that you weren't able to go to jail or you didn't face time for your crimes. Lots of people will feel it's unfair. So this significantly harms your ability to have any quality of life, right? So the harms of prison are you don't have a social life. You're not able to meet your family. But in that situation, your family would likely avoid you. In that situation, all your friends would likely not talk to you. In that situation, where everyone hates you and there's so much backlash, you're never going to be able to get a job. You're never going to have a proper life. We take this debate on many fronts. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the government whip for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close off the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Can I be heard?
You can.
Cool. Hold on, muting my messenger app. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to begin my speech by dealing with closing government first, because they chose to derail a beautiful debate about principles into a debate about procedural logistics. Then I'm going to weigh to our top half, who had the second best principle in the debate. And lastly, I'll explain why we will fill OG's duty to victims better than they do. First, let's deal with the practical case we got out of CG. Their first claim is that Yin might commit a crime again. A, Yin probably isn't a serial killer. The probability that he's going to go around continuing to reoffend is fairly low, just on the basis, as opening opposition analyzed you, that most serious crimes happen to people who are close to the perpetrator. That is to say, they come out in close relationships. Random acts of violence against a stranger tend to be rare because most crimes are not premeditated and are not motivated by just random acts of wanting to commit violence or bloodlust. It tends to be vengeance. It tends to be crimes of passion. It tends to be anger in a heat of the moment. These things tend to be specifically targeted, which means on balance of probabilities, it's likely not to be the case that there will be recidivism within this debate. But secondly, there are alternate methods the state can pursue in terms of monitoring the twins via ankle bracelet, keeping them under surveillance, therapy that Yang can elect to pursue that keep them out of trouble as well on their side of the house. I don't understand why this form of recourse isn't something we have access to equally on our side. But even if it were, and even if it was the case that Yin might commit a crime again, this is still not justification for putting the twins in prison, because we don't punish people on the predisposition that they might have to commit future crimes. It might be the case that a low-income neighborhood has a particularly high crime rate. We still don't throw random low-income individuals in prison just because they come from that neighborhood. Given that that is the case, you cannot access the duty to potential future victims in this debate as having any reasonable moral claim in standing in this debate. Secondly, on emotional trauma, note that a lot of the analysis they give about how you feel like something terrible happened, how your heart beats in sync with the perpetrator, are literally non-comparative in the debate at the point at which this person is still your brother and you still feel like something terrible happened. They never explain to you at any point why this analysis is comparative at all. You still likely feel badly about what happened on on either side. The question then is on which side we inflict a greater moral harm. The second thing then they say is that in prison, you're not going to feel like you have to watch your brother because you'll feel like it's the duty of your guards. Note the contradiction and tension within their own case. If you feel very passionately about failing to have stopped your brother committing a crime before, when all of society around you accords like policemen and other individuals with the responsibility of stopping crimes, I have no idea why, if it's the case that there is a grotesque level of harm of being attached physically to a murderer who is related to you, you still don't feel some degree of obligation to like try to watch your brother from like getting into a gang and a brawl within prison and so on and so forth. Given that that is the case, I have no idea, and they don't analyze to us why it is the case you still don't feel that way. Thirdly, on backlash, given that we already accept sometimes in a society that people who committed terrible crimes sometimes don't have to imprison in sketchy situations, that is to say, when we don't like literally like rage against the state when people who commit serious crimes that plead for an insanity defense end up in therapy instead, it's probably the case that political backlash will be fairly minimal. But even if it's the case that it's not, and like there is some degree of backlash, I think we're reasonably fine with biting that harm, given that they never quantify you to the degree that there's actually going to be any degree of backlash, and given that it's probably the case that they don't analyze to you why public sentiment will side in your favor if you committed a terrible crime, especially if the media spin Yang as being associated with that crime. Similarly, given that they say that it won't be a very bad prison, I just think this is completely absurd. It's entirely unclear, and they never analyze to you why public sentiment will side in your favor if you committed a terrible crime, especially since media will probably spin Yang as being associated with that crime. But finally, even if you buy all of the practicals and Yang is better off at the end of the debate, they never engage with Naomi's case except to belittle it and say it's a lot of intuition pumps. Our arguments are entirely non-contingent on the practical outcome to Yang. Even if it is something in your objective interest from a third-party perspective, the state has no right to presume that interest on your behalf. It's probably bad for me to get drunk after I win this final. It's probably also bad to play a dangerous sport like football, but the state has no right to infringe on my liberties. And given that that is the case, I have no idea why, from an objective third-party perspective, this being true means that we weigh it highly in the debate if you credit our principles. Before I get into weighing the opening against the opening opposition, I'll engage with CG.
So this debate is not about whether or not this house believes that the state should imprison them, but from the third party perspective, which is the house, should they be imprisoned? So the instrumentalization stuff does not work.
No, it does, because the state is the actor who's going to be imprisoning him. The motion presupposes that. Moving on, let's talk about the opening opposition characterization. I want to first flag that nothing that the opening opposition claims in terms of like potential characterization or potential extraneous nuanced harms matters in this debate if we prove our principle. Their principle is contingent on the claim that prison is really shitty, and therefore you should not elect to imprison the twins based on what creates the least harm. This firstly relies on the characterization that prison is more shit than the harm that was done to a victim. This is ultimately a utilitarian argument that no one can ultimately be certain of. Or to put it in terms as Joseph would, we as debaters lack epistemic access to the degree of harm done to both parties. Given that that is the case, our principle is more important because it says that the relative scale of harm is irrelevant. It is a moral wrong within itself to instrumentalize someone at the behest of the state. Their second principled claim in this debate is that Yang never tried to commit a form of self-defense, but it's unclear why in and of itself that shifts the weighing metric of justice in the debate. I'm unclear after opening opposition why it is a greater moral harm not to imprison Yin, even if it is the case that Yang acted with some degree of valor. How then, given those things, given our principle is more offensive, given our principle has more certainty, how then should you weigh the debate? Firstly, on the certainty of harm, we prove that there is a moral wrong that exists regardless of the amount of aggregate harm done to both parties. Regardless of how you weigh proportional justice in this debate, we prove that there is a certain harm that comes about as a result of state instrumentalization, which necessarily is logically prior to any theorizing that comes out about what probability one is likely greater than the other. And secondly, we win on balance of likely probabilities. Our principle stands in more cases. Opening opposition hinged their principle on a lot of caveats that are uncertain. They based it around theorizing about whether or not the state forced Yin to commit a crime of necessity. It's unclear if that's true, and our case is not contingent on it even if it wasn't. Similarly, their case relies on the idea that prison is worse than the harm already done, given that I've already proved that that is very morally dubious and ultimately collapses within a utilitarian justification. I think we're ahead. What did Naomi bring you? Why does it add away? Naomi explained to you that the state is a uniquely coercive instrument and institution, and you cannot instrumentalize Yang for the potential benefits of societal protection that might arise, even if there were secondary and tertiary practical outcomes. Naomi explained to you that persons should not merely be used as means for the welfare of others, because doing so violates a fundamental right of self-ownership that Yang continues to possess. We don't think the state putting an innocent person in jail in order to create some kind of deterrence effect would be beneficial for the remainder of society, would be morally justified. But Naomi goes further than this and explains that there is an act-omission distinction that exists in this debate. That is to say that it is morally random that you're being placed in this position in the first place, and given that the state has a legitimate action that they are taking that is is morally wrong in the case of punishing Yang, but there is an action that is uncertain by not punishing Yang, they ought avoid taking this action. Given that that is the case, we think that insofar as you, by opening government's principle to any extent in this debate, that the state has an obligation to victims, given that we prove that Yang is the only victim that you can be certain about that you are punishing, and also that it is entirely arbitrary insofar as like you ultimately like having this act of omission distinction, whether or not these future harms will ultimately accrue within this debate. I think we take it over opening government as well, because even insofar as opening government's principle is just that the state has an obligation to victims, we explain why we better fulfill it as well. Very proud to win.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to thank you all again for what was a lovely final.